Hello, and thanks again for joining me for another in a series of videos on how to replace or upgrade the bearings in your Align T-Rex 450 Pro helicopter. The first video I made was to show you how to replace the bearings in your tail blade grips and tail case in your 450 helicopter. This time we're going to show you how to replace the four bearings on the umbrella gears in the transmission case in your helicopter. Now again, when people make repairs after a crash, they often replace the stripped gears, the broken blades, the bent shafts, things like that. And sometimes those bearings get neglected. So you want to get in the habit of inspecting the bearings that are associated with the parts that you have damaged. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started on this demonstration. The tools you're going to need for this particular replacement: once again, your ball link pliers, a 1.5mm hex driver, some Loctite to reinstall all of your metal to metal parts, and your upgraded bearings. Once again, the good folks over at Boca Bearing sent me this upgrade kit to demonstrate how to replace these bearings. Now, on a 450 size helicopter, people run a head speed of anywhere between 2,500, 3,500 RPMs and up. And that translates into 4 times the RPMs in your tail. So the bearings in your transmission case that turn the torque tube can be spinning at upwards of 15,000, 16,000 RPM. So you want to be real diligent in checking those bearings, make sure those aren't getting worn down, those aren't failing. And the Boca bearings that I'm going to be putting in are designed for higher temperatures, higher RPMs, and they hold up very, very well. The first thing you're going to need to do to get the transmission case out of the back of the helicopter where those torque tube gears sit is to disconnect the linkage from your tail servo. Now you can do that one of two ways. The servo tray here is held in place by 2 screws on either side. You can either take both those out and remove the tail servo completely, or for brevity and ease, you can take the top screw out of each side here. And what that does is allow you to rock that servo tray back just slightly and give you access to that ball. You can take your ball link pliers here. You can get under that servo wire and pop that linkage off. The next thing you need to do is take your 1.5mm hex driver, and on 4 screws on either side of that transmission case, you're going to pull those out. And this is where a good quality hex driver comes into play. The better the quality of that hex driver, the less chance of stripping screws as you do these repairs and installations. So you want to get a real good quality hex driver to pull these out. So there's those 4 screws. Flip the helicopter over. There's 4 more screws, 2 at the back of the frame. There's 1. There's 2. Three screws. And the last screw. Now once you get those 8 screws out, you're going to need to do a couple other things to remove that tail. First, you're going to have to take off your tail support struts there, and each one is held by 1 screw. When you go to put this back together, make sure you pay attention to what screw is what, because the screws that hold on these supports are slightly longer than the other screws. So you want to set that aside and make sure that goes back into the tail support. We're going to pull that off there. Now what I've also found necessary to do for ease of pulling this apart, and I've already removed this screw here on the anti-rotation bracket and the tray that holds my flybarless unit is either remove these screws completely and pull that off, or just loosen them so that these frame parts will spread out a little bit better. Once you got all those screws out, your whole tail assembly should pull straight out like that, and you can set that aside. Now to pull this out, oops, I forgot one screw here. Now to pull your transmission case out, what you need to do is separate your frames slightly, because you can see that there's a piece of plastic from the transmission case that slots into the frames. So you want to be real careful to pull these apart. Now, what I do for ease of installation is I route my wires on the outside of the frame. If you routed wires inside the frame and you snake them between that transmission case, you're going to want to be real careful when you pull that transmission case so that you're not pulling on your servo wires. Once you get past those little indents, your whole transmission case comes out like that. Go ahead and set your helicopter aside, and you've got your transmission case with your torque tube, your umbrella gears sitting in there. Now this is just held together with pressure, and by rocking it back and forth and just kind of working it, you can pull this transmission case apart. And the more even you pull it, the easier it is. Now you'll notice that there's 4 kind of hex nuts that hold those two pieces together. Sometimes those hex nuts will come out in one side like they did here. Other times they'll come out, 2 of them here, 1 of them on the other side. It doesn't really matter because they're just sort of free floating, and you can put that back together at a later time. But what you've got now is you got access to your umbrella gears, and you can see that there's 2 bearings on this piece that connects to your torque tube, and 2 bearings, one on either side of this shaft, that connect to your anti-rotation gear here. So now that I got these 2 pieces out, the first step in the process is to pull the old bearings off. Now typically the 2 smaller bearings that sit on either end of this shaft will pop off very easily. Sometimes they are put on with a little bit of retaining compound by the factory, and you're going to have to kind of work to get those off. But these come off fairly easily. Now the 2 bearings on this plastic piece, these are a different story. These can sometimes be a challenge to get off because they sit on there really, really tight. This one on the outside, generally you can just pull off with your fingers like that. This inside bearing is a little bit more of a challenge. Now what I do is take my ball link pliers that has this little horseshoe shaped indent here, and I can use that to kind of work that bearing down off of this gear to start it out, so that you have a little bit of space to work with. Now what you can do now is, if you take 2 hex drivers, usually the 1.5 millimeter ones are a little bit smaller, and you put 1 on either side of that bearing and press with equal pressure, most of the time that bearing will come off. Now when you're replacing these bearings, obviously if you're going to throw this old bearing away, you don't have to worry about any damage, so you can work that sucker off pretty good. But equal pressure on either side, and that thing starts to slide off. Once you've got a little bit of space there, you can sometimes get your fingers in there and work it off until it slides off, and then pull that off. Now I've got my new bearings here from Boca. You'll notice there's 2 different sizes. There's a larger inner diameter and a smaller one. Obviously the larger ones go on your umbrella gear here that connects to your torque tube. So you take one of those gears, or one of those bearings, and slide it all the way down until it's seated flush with the end of that plastic piece. The second bearing will go on the end, and that sits flush with the end there. Now obviously the way you test that is you can put it back in your transmission case, and you'll see that there's 2 indents there where that bearing sits. Put those back in there, ensure that they're the proper spacing, the bearing spin, or the gear spins freely, and you're good to go with that piece. The other 2 bearings go on the end of this shaft, and those are real easy to install. And again, what you can do is put these bearings in their indents on your transmission case. You see that they both roll freely, and you're ready to put your transmission case back together. And again, just like you took this apart, the more even you put this back together so you don't get a funky angle, the easier it goes back together. And you take your metal pieces in there, those inserts, and make sure they're sitting flush, and you got your transmission case back together. Make sure that those are rolling right, the bearings are seated properly, and you're ready to install this back in your helicopter body. So I've got my helicopter body here, and you'll notice that a lot of my wires sit between that helicopter, that gear transmission case, and the tray above. So I want to make sure all those wires are out of the way before I put this back in. Now, the orientation, the way this goes back in, is this gear down here goes to the bottom where it links into your anti-rotation gear there. And you want to separate your frames just enough to get that in, making sure you're not grabbing any of those wires on the way down. You might have to stretch your frames out just a little bit to get it in there. Now that's going to snap in when those two plastic pieces hit these openings in your frame. Make sure that's nice and snug there. You can go ahead and reinstall all the screws in that case, especially the ones in the front. You're going to wait until you get your tail boom back into the back, and that's seated nice and flush before you put the back screws in, and then you want to cinch that down. So we'll go ahead and turn the camera off and get that test taken care of. Okay, so before I put all the screws back in, what I wanted to do is give you a very important reminder that when you're putting any screw back in, where it's a metal screw into a metal part, you're going to want to use your Loctite so they don't vibrate out while you're flying. And again, like I told you in the last video, you want to put just enough Loctite on those threads, wipe off the excess, and get those screws installed nice and snug. Once you get all your screws installed, it's a good idea to let that Loctite cure for several hours, or more ideally overnight, before you try and fly your helicopter. And one more quick note before I get this whole thing put back together. Make sure that before you put your screws back into this servo tray and you still have a little bit of room to work, you want to re-engage that ball link on top of the servo there. Because once that rocks up into position, you can see that there's very, very little room to get that ball reattached to the link. Okay, so I've got all 8 screws put back into my transmission case using Loctite. I've got my anti-rotation bracket reinstalled. Now these are metal into plastic, so you're not going to use any Loctite on there. You're just going to cinch them down so they're nice and snug. I've got my tail support rods reinstalled. I've got my linkage rod reattached here to my servo. And I've got my servo tray reinstalled. So I'll get my blades back on. I'll let all the Loctite dry overnight, and we'll head out tomorrow and see how it flies.